It started with one person who saw something, or thought they saw something. By morning, 3 people had made the same accusation. By the following week, 19 were dead.
Witchcraft Visisanda! Drive madness! Burn evil from beneath!
No war, no disease, no natural disaster, just fear. What you're about to see is not fiction. No screenwriter invented these stories. No director staged these scenes. These are the documented, verified accounts of real communities, real people who, at some point in history, collectively lost their grip on reality. In Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, in Jonestown, Guyana in 1978, and in the entire eastern seaboard of the United States in 1938. Different centuries, different cultures, different triggers. But by the end of this video, you're going to see that what happened in each of these places was not random. It was not a coincidence. And once you see it, you're going to wonder whether you'd be immune to it. This wasn't the only village, and it wouldn't be the last. January 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts. Mud roads frozen solid, animals dying in the cold, a community that had not known a single peaceful year in a decade, Indian raids to the north, smallpox outbreaks, a government in collapse, and a theology that told them every misfortune was God's judgment. These people were exhausted, they were frightened, they were holding on. And then one evening, Reverend Samuel Parris heard a sound from the next room that stopped his heart.
Can you hear me? Wake up.
What happened?
You're safe now. Stay with me.
Help me.
Betty was 9 years old. She was her father's daughter, quiet, obedient, the kind of child who folded her hands during grace and never needed to be asked twice. And now she was screaming at things that weren't there. Her cousin Abigail lived with them too. Within days, Abigail was doing the same, throwing herself across the floor, barking like an animal, crying out that invisible teeth were biting her arms. Parris prayed. He fasted. He called for a doctor. The doctor came, examined both girls carefully, and then he said the words that would unmake the village. I can find no natural cause. There was a time when those words meant hope, a reason to keep looking. In Salem in 1692, they meant only one thing: the devil is here. Word moved through Salem the way fire moves through dry grass. And the question, the terrible, inevitable question, began passing from mouth to mouth. Who is doing this to these children? Imagine being 9 years old and your father, your neighbors, your minister, surrounding you and asking to name whatever it is that torments you. Imagine the weight of that room pressing down on a child. The girls gave them names. The first was Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados who had no one to speak for her. The second, Sarah Good, a beggar woman who slept in barns and talked to herself on the road. And then Sarah Osborne, a widow who hadn't attended church in over a year. The 3 most vulnerable women in Salem. And this is the moment, this exact moment, that breaks my heart. Because you can see it in the historical record, in the testimonies, in the letters. When those 3 women were named, something shifted in the village. The terror didn't disappear, but it focused. And a focused fear feels almost like safety.
Gentlemen, the hour is late. We must unite now or be undone.
Hear, hear.
Then let us proceed.
Tituba did something unexpected, she confessed. Not because she was guilty, but because she understood exactly how much her life was worth in that room. She gave them everything they wanted. Yes, she had seen the devil. Yes, he had come to her as a black dog, a yellow bird, a tall man in dark clothes. Yes, there were other witches in Salem. She could feel them. She named no one, not yet, but she told them the coven was real. And the courtroom exhaled. Tituba survived. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne did not confess. Sarah Osborne died in prison before she could hang. Sarah Good stood on the gallows and, when the minister urged her to confess and save her soul, looked him in the eye and said, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." She was hanged on a Tuesday morning in July. Her daughter Dorothy, 4 years old, had already been arrested and was sitting in a Boston jail. As winter thawed into spring and spring into summer, the accusations did not slow. They accelerated. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, a grandmother, a woman so devout, so loved, that when her name was first spoken in the courtroom, 39 of her neighbors signed a petition declaring her innocent. The jury acquitted her, but the judge sent them back to reconsider. They reconvicted. The governor's wife had been accused by this point. The governor granted Rebecca Nurse a reprieve. The accusers had new fits. The reprieve was reversed. She was hanged on July 19th. Her family buried her in secret in the dark on their own land because they were afraid that even her body would be taken from them. And then there was Giles Corey, 80 years old, a farmer, stubborn as the land he'd worked for half a century. His wife Martha had already been accused and was in prison awaiting trial. When they came for Giles, he made a decision that no one, not the judges, not the sheriff, not history itself, quite knew what to do with. He refused to enter a plea. Not guilty, not innocent, nothing. Under English law, a person who refused to enter a plea could be subjected to pressing, heavy stones placed on the chest until the accused either entered a plea or died. Giles Corey knew this. He chose it anyway. For 2 days, they laid stones on his chest in an open field, his neighbors watching, the sheriff attending to the legal formality of it all. Each time the sheriff asked if he would enter a plea, Giles Corey said the same 2 words: more weight. He died on September 19th, 1692. He never entered a plea. By refusing to participate in the court's process, he protected his estate from being seized, ensuring that when it was over, his children would inherit what he had built. In his final act, Giles Corey was not a man being crushed by stones. He was a father. By October, something had finally cracked. The governor's wife had been named. The president of Harvard had been named, a minister, a ship's captain, a 4-year-old girl. At some point, the circle of accusation grows wide enough that it begins to include people who cannot be witches, people the community cannot bring itself to destroy. And in that moment, the spell breaks. The court was dissolved in October. The remaining prisoners were released in May of the following year. 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death. Several more had died in prison, including an infant. I don't want to leave Salem with a theory. I want to leave it with a face. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old. 39 neighbors who loved her enough to sign their names to her defense. A jury that acquitted her before they were sent back and told to reconsider. Somewhere in that jury room, on that second deliberation, 32 people decided they had been wrong, or decided it was too dangerous to be right. What would you have done in that jury room? I don't ask that to be cruel. I ask it because the answer is not as simple as we'd like it to be. And the next story I'm about to tell you, set not in 1692 but in 1938, proves exactly that. Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. October 30th, 1938, Halloween Eve. 60 million Americans had radios in their homes, and at 8 p.m. on this particular Sunday night, many of them tuned into CBS. What they heard would trigger one of the most extraordinary collective psychological events in recorded history. The broadcast was a dramatization, an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds, produced by a 23-year-old theater director named Orson Welles. Welles had a gift for understanding fear, not just what frightened people, but how they needed to be frightened. And so he made a choice that would define his legacy and terrify a nation. He didn't frame the story as science fiction. He framed it as a news broadcast. The broadcast began normally. Dance music, weather, the ordinary sounds of a Sunday night. Then the interruption. A reporter, breathless and increasingly panicked, describing what appeared to be meteorites falling near Grover's Mill, New Jersey. "Something's wriggling out of the shadow like a grey snake. Now it's another one, and another. They look like tentacles to me." Here is where the psychology becomes fascinating and terrifying. Many of the people who panicked that night had tuned in late after the disclaimer at the start of the program explaining it was fiction. They missed the frame. And once you've missed the frame, once you're already inside the story without knowing it's a story, the human brain does something remarkable and dangerous. It decides at a level below conscious thought that what it's hearing must be real. Because why would something that sounds this real not be real? Across the northeastern United States, the reaction was swift. Phone lines jammed. People wrapped their faces in wet towels, believing it would protect them from Martian gas. Drivers abandoned their cars in the middle of roads. A woman in Indianapolis ran into a church during evening services screaming that the end of the world had come. In New Jersey, the supposed landing site, local highways became gridlocked as residents fled into the countryside. Now, here is what historians have also found, and this is crucial. The panic was significantly exaggerated by the newspapers the following morning. In 1938, radio was new. It had only recently overtaken newspapers as America's primary news source. And the newspaper industry, threatened, jealous, afraid, had every incentive to make radio look dangerous. The story of a panic became its own panic. People who'd heard nothing about Martian invasions suddenly recalled being frightened. Memory, it turns out, is not a recording. It is a story we tell ourselves, and stories can be edited. The real question is why people were so ready to panic. Europe is on the edge of war. Hitler has just annexed Austria. It feels like the world is falling apart. When people are already afraid, the threshold for believing the worst drops dramatically. Psychologists call this preparatory anxiety, the state in which the nervous system is already primed for catastrophe. You don't cause the panic. You just provide the trigger. I want you to think about that idea, the trigger, as we move forward. What we've seen so far in Salem and in 1938 are cases where the trigger was accidental or arguably artistic. What happens when the trigger is deliberate? What happens when someone designs the fear? In 1978, 918 people are living in a settlement they have named Jonestown. They came here voluntarily. Most of them left everything behind, jobs, homes, families, bank accounts, to follow a man they believed was a prophet. His name was Jim Jones, and his understanding of human psychology was, in the most disturbing sense, remarkable. Jones began as something real when he founded the People's Temple. In Indianapolis in the 1950s, he ran one of the first racially integrated congregations in Indiana at a time when that was genuinely radical, genuinely dangerous. He fed the poor. He housed the homeless. He offered community to people who had none. This matters because cults never begin with cruelty. They begin with love. By the time the congregation moved to Guyana in 1977, something had shifted. The love remained, but it had become conditional. Over time, Jones became more controlling, urging followers to adopt communal living and donate their property and finances to the church. Jones had begun to use a technique that psychologists now study as a cornerstone of coercive control. Alternating reinforcement, praise and punishment, warmth and terror, belonging, and the constant devastating threat of its removal. At night, Jones would hold what he called white nights. He would announce that enemies were approaching, that the CIA was coming, that fascists, racists, the forces of a corrupt outside world were closing in. Jones would then inform his congregation that rather than be captured, they would die together, with dignity, with love. To prove their loyalty, he staged chilling rehearsals. The congregation would drink a liquid they were told was poison. and then Jones would reveal, sometimes after minutes, sometimes after hours, that it was a test, that they had passed, that their willingness to die proved their devotion. He ran these drills again and again and again. What Jones was doing has a clinical name: systematic desensitization, except in reverse. Instead of reducing fear responses, he was building them, conditioning his followers to associate death not with terror, but with loyalty, with love. When November 18th, 1978 finally arrived, Jones had rehearsed his congregation for this moment so many times that the line between rehearsal and reality had effectively ceased to exist. As concern grew for the people living deep within the jungle settlement, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown in November 1978. Ryan was gunned down by temple gunmen alongside 4 others while trying to leave. The killings marked the point of no return. With the outside world now closing in and violence already unleashed, Jim Jones made the decision that would seal Jonestown's fate. Jones's aides filled vats with fruit-flavored drink, but this time infused with real poison. 918 people died that day. 276 of them were children. Jim Jones was later discovered dead, having suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Some believe he died by suicide, while others suggest his nurse, Annie Moore, shot him before taking her own life. And when the world called it a mass suicide, survivors and the evidence tell a different story. People who tried to refuse were held down, injected. There were armed guards at the exits. It was not suicide. It was the end point of a years-long psychological campaign to make a group of people believe they had no other choice. The people who followed Jim Jones were not stupid. They were not weak. They were not, in any meaningful sense, different from you. Many of them were teachers, nurses, community organizers, people who had dedicated their lives to making the world better. They were lonely. They were idealistic. They wanted to belong to something larger than themselves. We've now looked at 3 cases, 3 very different places, 3 very different centuries, but I promised you a pattern, and it's time to show you what connects them. Let's look at what these 3 events share. Salem village was physically remote, surrounded by wilderness that Puritans genuinely believed was populated by the devil's agents. The 1938 radio listeners were emotionally isolated, already anxious, already disconnected from reliable information in a world that felt unpredictably dangerous. Jonestown was literally carved out of jungle, 7 degrees north of the equator, days from the nearest city, surrounded by guards. Something happens to the human brain. It begins to mistake the loudest voice in the room for the truest voice in the room. In Salem, the ministers, the judges, the court itself. If a person of recognized authority believed the accusations, then doubt became not just illogical, but sinful. In 1938, the voice on the radio was formatted to sound like a news anchor, like Walter Cronkite, like the voice of official truth. The authority was borrowed, but it worked. In Jonestown, Jim Jones had built an authority so total, so reinforced, so intertwined with the deepest human need for belonging, that to question him was to question God. Human beings are, at the deepest biological level, herd animals. We are wired from birth in our nervous systems to read the emotional states of the people around us and mirror them. This is not weakness. This is the same neural machinery that kept our ancestors alive for 200,000 years. If the person next to you on the savannah started running, you didn't stop to ask why. You ran. Isolation removes the corrective voice of outside reality. Authority provides a single dominant narrative to fill the void. Social contagion ensures that the narrative spreads and that the cost of resistance becomes unbearable. 3 ingredients, and an ordinary group of human beings becomes a village that has lost its mind. Today, we have platforms that can reach 2 billion people with a single post. Algorithms engineered, not maliciously but efficiently, to amplify exactly the kind of content that triggers the deepest panic responses: outrage, threat, the certainty that they are coming for us. We have online communities, beautiful, warm, human communities, that can slowly become isolated in their certainty, that begin to mistake the loudest voice in the feed for the truest voice in the world. The real question isn't if it could happen again, but when.